Hello, welcome. My name is Davin Waite, and I work with the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County. If you're tuned in tonight, that means you've joined us for a digital lecture on the history of Rollag's Woodland School from architectural historian Steve Martens. Before I get started, I want to note that ASL interpretation is available for tonight's talk. So if you'd like ASL interpretation, pin our interpreter for tonight. She's listed as ASL interpreter Mocktel, Kayla Mocktel, into your Zoom feed. Let me next thank you all for joining us. We view these online presentations as central to our mission of preserving and sharing the history and culture of Clay County. And we appreciate your support of local history and historical literacy. If you would like to further support our efforts, please consider visiting our museum at the Yemcomp Center in Moorhead or joining the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County as a member. You can find the details to do so on our website at www.hcscconline.org. Let me also note that if you have any questions for Steve, you can write those into the Zoom chat or the Facebook Live comments, and we'll hold a moderated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And before I introduce our historian for the evening, let me also thank our sponsors, as the research you will hear tonight was made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Tonight's speaker, Steve Martens, taught architecture and historic preservation at North Dakota State University in Fargo for 30 years. In addition to his professional credential as an architect, he earned a post-professional graduate degree in architectural history and historic preservation from the University of Minnesota. He is also a proud graduate of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation's White Shield School. He currently serves as president of the North Dakota State Historical Society and is a past recipient of North Dakota's Heritage Profile Honor Award. Ooh. Let me also add, if you are joining us on Zoom tonight, to please mute your feed. I will try to catch those as you log in. Steve's research has focused on the material culture of the Northern Great Plains, including a comprehensive statewide survey and analysis of North Dakota work relief construction. He's authored 30 successful National Register nominations, led several student historical American Building Survey recording teams, contributed articles to the Encyclopedia of the Great Plains and the Encyclopedia of Rural America, and co-authored the book Buildings of North Dakota. Tonight, he will share research conducted for the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County on Rollag, Minnesota's District 3 Woodland School. Steve, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. It was so nice to see the list of names as people were logging in there. Several old friends that I'm glad to have participating this evening. So I very much look forward to sharing the story. I played a little bit fast and loose with the title. Davin and I conspired a little in the beginning. I wanted to call it something about the comparison to something like being homeschooled, only better. There was a lot about those rural country schools that really filled the role of a family approach to education. And where I ended up with the title, I decided, you know, what we're really about here is telling stories out of school. And so I hope that there's nothing here that will offend anybody, the stories that I'm going to tell out of school, but it is the story of Rollag's Woodland Township School number 3, 65 years of effective elementary education in a rural setting. So that means that this school was active an active feature of rural community from 1896 to 1961. That's just a remarkable fact. And I am very, very glad that Devin got the acknowledgements out of the way for the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. That's an important acknowledgement to make. They have been very gracious and generous about funding research and National Register nominations and so forth. So we should probably talk a little bit this evening about what the purposes and benefits of that are. I also would like to thank Dr. Maureen Kelly Jonason for inviting me to get involved with this. She and I have actually been talking about the need to determine the eligibility of the Rollag School for National Register listing for about 5 or 6 years. And she was kind enough to wait until I had some time in my schedule to contribute to this. And so the purpose of the project that we've undertaken with this grant support is to research and evaluate the eligibility of the one-room country schoolhouse for a National Register nomination. And as we go forward, I have about, I think, 15 pages of notes here and about 30 slides. I'd like to try to cover our topic in about 35 or 40 minutes, and would be delighted if you have questions or things that I can maybe refresh my memory about. And I wanted to thank too Mark Peel and Lisa Veda and Davin for the support on all the access to the building, access to the archives here at the Cultural Heritage Society of Clay County. It's been a real team effort that I've been fortunate to be involved with. And for me, late in my career as a researcher and a student of the built environment, it's been especially gratifying to have the opportunity to reflect on the meaning of these buildings in their setting. And so part of what we have produced in the way of a product, we were really, our goal was to demonstrate that this project was National Register eligible. And it seemed apparent to me from the first photographs I saw of it and my first visit out there to drive by in the winter that clearly it was. And there's some special, I guess, tricks or quirks that need to be followed in order to demonstrate that so that the project will go forward for National Register consideration. And I'd like to visit with you a little bit here early in the presentation about what that means, what National Register listing of a property means. And I assume that's probably familiar to many of you, but not necessarily all. And I maybe am treating it a little differently than some might. So having been involved with local history and commonplace vernacular architecture for about 45 years of my adult life, it's always a process of discovery and an opportunity to celebrate the wonderful things of local heritage. Some of the best nominations that I've read for the I sat 2 terms on the state review board for the state of North Dakota considering National Register nominations before they were sent forward to the keeper of the register and the National Park Service for final action. And I always found it just remarkable that those that were written with the most passion and caring and understanding were oftentimes written by local people who didn't necessarily have any architectural training. And I think in the beginning of the National Register process, that was a very strong inclination to invite people to try their best at telling the story of these historic buildings. Now, as time has gone on, I think maybe the standards for scholarship have gotten a bit higher, and it's probably a little intimidating for people to imagine how would we answer the questions to get our property listed on the National Register. But I do firmly believe that telling the story convincingly means telling it from the heart and knowing your local circumstances first and foremost. So the other gratitude that needs to be expressed, and I'll emphasize it a couple times on the way through the presentation here, is to a dedicated group of local friends and graduates of this diligently preserved country school. I'm not sure that any of the young people that are pictured in this first slide are still with us today, but a lot of people who attend the alumni meetings and share their memories and reminiscences have really added to our understanding about what a feature like this means to our heritage. locally, in the state, and nationally. So let's see if this will allow me to go forward. Let's see. Davin, I seem not to be getting control of the of advancing the slides. Yeah, that's good. Great, thank you. The purpose of the grant that was written was to determine the eligibility. The National Register process is administered nationally, and it attempts to follow the same rules and guidelines and principles in all parts of the country, understanding that there are a whole range of different kinds of features that may be considered for National Register nomination and listing. They range from landscapes to engineered structures to historic sites, and to buildings and contexts, even National Register historic districts. I checked yesterday, and currently there are about 85,000 individual properties, individual buildings or sites that are listed on the National Register, and another 13,600 historic districts. And so in my career, I've had an opportunity to reflect on that for a lot of communities who are kind and generous enough to open their doors and share their local heritage with me. The National Register was established only in 1966. Many people might suspect that it would have been longer ago than that, but it was part of the U.S. federal preservation historic preservation law, and that included a number of measures that were done for the purpose of incentivizing people to care for their historic heritage. And the National Register was created as an honorific, a place that buildings and features that are important to our national heritage could be recognized for future generations. So being listed on the National Register first requires that someone has to make a recommendation about its eligibility. And that can be done at the same time as the nomination in Minnesota, because they have quite a number of properties every year that are nominated and considered. They want someone to do a determination of the eligibility beforehand, before they will fund the actual grant to write the National Register nomination. But if we've done our job well here in this eligibility study, it should be a simple matter going forward to get the property listed in about another year's time to fill out the forms and answer the questions for the National Register nominations. Eligibility first and nomination second. The National Register emphasizes 4 criteria that can be applied equitably to all features, and the significance must be demonstrated, that the property has to be significant to our heritage in terms of either one of 4 criteria. Criterion A has to do with historical events or patterns of history. Criterion C has to do with construction or style or methods of construction. Criterion B deals with buildings that are exceptionally important for their associations with a person. And the 4th criterion D has to do with features that have archaeological significance or the potential to add to our knowledge. So it was quite apparent that the 2 aspects of significance of this historic country school would be the events that were associated with its construction, its operation, its lifetime of use, the relationship to community for the 65 years that it functioned as a local fixture and feature. It may have some additional significance in terms of the way it was constructed. And I developed that argument in the eligibility report, and it got a kind of a lukewarm response from the reviewers at the State Historic Preservation Office. They said, well, it's just typical of many of the country schools. And I think that's really kind of the point, as I would see it, that this is representative of the many schools that are no longer on the landscape. And so the fact that it's not distinctively different from what we associate with this building type is not a count against it, but rather an argument for its significance under that criterion. The eligibility determination also addresses aspects of context. And again, from my perspective, the associations of this building with the landscape in which it's situated, with the Norwegian American and Swedish American communities that are grounded in those Rollag hills, with the advance of the railroad and the establishment of communities, those are all contexts that seem to me to have explain the reason why this school was established and functioned so well for so long. But again, that was the reviewers felt that I had focused a bit too much attention on that. And so we've kind of pared down the argument going forward into the National Register nomination, that really it focuses more on the educational role of this building as a country school. Eligibility ultimately is determined by the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office, the Historic Preservation Division, which is an administrative unit of state government. And this eligibility study only makes a recommendation. So the point of the National Register, and I suppose maybe that's kind of cutting to the quick here, is that it does make a property eligible for future grants having to do with maintenance and preservation and care of a building, so long as the work is consistent with the guidelines that are established by the Secretary of Interior. It's a program administered through the National Park Service, and the Secretary of Interior's guidelines establish the level of quality for all work that is performed on historic buildings. And so long as it can be demonstrated that work is proceeding according to those guidelines, the project, once it's National Register listed, will be eligible for those. In fact, it is already eligible for those resources, because it has been determined eligible now. And so the National Register takes that another step in terms of putting it on the record. And I think that's an important step that oftentimes gets overlooked in the National Register process, is that it shares the local experience of this school and the community that lived in this school with the local place. It shares that with a larger audience, a broader audience. Now, the National Register nominations are accessible. Maybe some of you have found your way to a favorite of yours through Wikipedia. They're all listed for the state of Minnesota, and you can go county by county and click on them and get access to that full nomination, which includes photographs and maps and historical documentation, and then the rationale that was used to establish the property's significance. And I think that's a really important contribution that we can make to share our experience more broadly, to share it with people in other parts of the country. We've even had inquiries from people in other nations that want to know about our local heritage. And so the building doesn't have to be the most grandiose or the most elaborate or the most unusual in terms of its design and features. It simply has to embody a local experience that is an important aspect of our shared heritage. So there's the synopsis, the summary. There are about 1,700 individual properties listed in Minnesota, plus 5,300 properties in Minnesota historic districts. And historic districts tend to are organized, you might think of them as neighborhoods in a community. The Oak Grove neighborhood in Fargo would be one historic district in which the buildings might individually be less significant, but their relationship, the continuity of the features, including both the landscaping of the neighborhood and the streetscapes and the buildings themselves, are all part of those historic districts. So again, we've kind of covered, I think, the way the National Register came to be. It started with documenting the colonial heritage of our nation's founders and the wealthy people of importance for each state. But as time has gone on, much more of the emphasis has tended to go toward commonplace buildings that tell our local story. And I think that's a really wonderful and gratifying thing to realize, that what happens in communities like Rollag or the Rollag Hills, or what happens in counties like Clay County, are just as much a part of our national heritage, or tell as much of a story about the people who we have become and the heritage that charted our direction for that. So the property is determined to be worthy of eligibility, worthy of National Register listing, and then there are incentives for qualified properties that are administered through state funding support, state grants to help with that. And so I know that one important goal of this National Register pursuit was to make sure that this property would be eligible for some additional care and treatment as time goes on. It's in pretty remarkable condition. The alumni volunteers have invested their time and money in keeping it clean and up to date and well painted and dry, and the roof is now about 50 years old, but it's in generally good condition. And the Cultural Heritage Society of Clay County has likewise invested effort in cleaning and keeping it and maintaining it. And that's the wonderful thing, that I think that's the investment that we need to continue to preserve going forward. The school was the first to open in Clay County in 1896 and the last to close in 1961. Kind of a remarkable set of bookends there that mark the importance of this place locally. It's some people might say that it was inevitable that it would close at some point in time. Some people might say that it was inevitable that the Norwegian American farm families that attended this school, that it would have been built at some point in time. But what I find it more distinctive and remarkable about it is that it continued and served that purpose in a changing context and a changing educational context, in which the expectations of local rural elementary school education, I want to emphasize that a couple of times here, you know, it would have been a lot to expect a little one-room school to deliver 12 years of public school education and 4 years of college education. It was really focused on the beginning learners. And that's why I think that what comparison with homeschooling is really quite apt. I think the education, the well-balanced education that was surprisingly covered all aspects of the curriculum, is something really worth celebrating and commemorating. So it was interesting to document the building on its site. Originally, the 1 acre parcel that it was on was the part that was dedicated to the school, and over time an additional piece has been added to it. So the situation of the building in the hills, it was fun. I suspect that several of you may have seen the nice feature article in the forum by Chris Hagan, who wanted to share his perceptions of this country school. And as soon as he drove up in front of the school, he said, you know, this landscape out here is absolutely magnificent. You drive through these, you know, cared for fields, you see the successful farms that are out here, you see the beauty of this place, and how welcoming a home it has become for families that live here. The families who sent their children to attend this country school all lived within about 2.5 miles of the school, say 2 to 2.5 miles in one direction or another from the school. So that was easy walking distance. So you hear people tell stories about, I had to walk through snowbanks when I was a kid to get to go 1.5 miles to school. But it was a reasonable, realistic opportunity for kids to get out of their family homes and to be with other people and learn all those social skills that go along with how we become functioning members of communities. And so I think in those respects, it's really much better than being homeschooled. It put these kids into contact with friends and neighbors. They got to learn focused areas of the curriculum. And we should talk a bit, I think, about what the curriculum consisted of. But part of the documentation for this is kind of a little measured drawings and quite a few photographs that go forward with the eligibility this study. It's just beautiful to see the school on a fall day. This was actually, I think, probably a spring day, because the leaves weren't out on the trees yet, and the oak trees that surround this school put it in a grove. It sits on the top of the hillside. It would have been visible to anybody trying to find their way to school in the morning, and then the trip home to the farm from the school at the end of the day was all downhill. So it became very common and popular. The Norwegian American school kids had their home-fashioned cross-country skis and would oftentimes ski home, and actually trudge through the snowbanks with their skis and there's some great photographic documentation of how this place was used. The well pump that sits out on the site, the privies or outhouses that serve the school kids have been gone for a number of years, but that was part of it too. The flagpole that is features prominently here, and then the school bell and the bell tower in the school. That's all part of what is commemorated, the characteristics of this place and the physical settings or context. Now, book research can be really dry and boring, and I felt the obligation to see what else had been written about country schools in the way of interpretations. Some excellent resource publications on Minnesota in a Century of Change, looking at how education has changed over the past 100 years. Several good books about country schools in particular from different parts of the country, but surprisingly, quite many of them have to do with schools in Minnesota and North Dakota. So, clearly it's a part of our cultural heritage, and the opportunity to interpret what that educational process meant for families and communities. Bibliographies can be kind of dull, but because one of the purposes of this eligibility study and the National Register nomination is for future scholars to be able to trace the findings that we have made. A bibliography is an important part of sharing that background and information. So those reminiscences are kept alive. It was really wonderful. Mark Peel shared with me a publication that was put together by a group of alumni. They meet every year the weekend before Labor Day at the school, and reminisce about favorite teachers and things that they remember from their school days, share photographs and remembrances of particular teachers. I think these historical documents and records that now have been compiled and are kept here archivally at the Cultural and Heritage Society of Clay County are another dimension of that story that is really worthy of letting people know that this resource is available here to us. The context, this school is clearly important for elementary education, and the State Historic Preservation Office says, that's enough. If you want to, in the National Register nomination, just focus on that one thing and show what its educational meaning and purpose was, that should be enough to tell the story. And I guess I would say that I fundamentally kind of disagree with that. I think that the connections between churches and schools, the schools were almost all established by church congregations first, and the presence of the railroad or the establishment of lumber yards in the nearby communities, that produced the materials that were distributed and the milled lumber and siding and so forth that were used to build this building. That immigrant settlement experience, in this case, it happened to be mostly Norwegian Americans, the second generation of immigrants to this community, and their contribution to agricultural developments and local community. So, I think we're looking at how education evolved in a statewide context, but it seems to me that it would be rather short-sighted to separate that from understanding that this school was a product of the people who occupied and used it, and the people who were served by it. So from the standpoint of interpretation, old buildings can tell their own story. So the school and the surrounding farms, if we listen a little bit carefully, the buildings tell their own story, and we've exercised the opportunity now to collect some of those stories and tell the stories of these farms in their setting and their environment. It's we're mindful that this school is distinctive and typical of the usual expected models. Most of them actually originated from what we refer to as New England extended, or the old Midwest, coming from the northeastern United States. The Yankee immigrants who came out and established many of these communities, as was the case with Rollag, first, they brought a familiar pattern or model for education along with them, and that's what was imposed on the landscape. I've always been a little bit found it peculiar that I kept getting a question from the reviewers at the State Historic Preservation Office that said, you really need to find the blueprints that were distributed by the state superintendent's office from which this school was built. And I think We all know enough about vernacular heritage to know that you don't need blueprints. You don't need a state superintendent's design for the layout of a one-room schoolhouse. This is judgment that was exercised by local people. This was their vision for how education could be delivered for typically about 35 students at one time, grades 1 through 8. At times 1 through 7, but 90% of all the country schools in Minnesota were very similar to this. It would be that 10%, the rare exceptions that kind of catch us off guard. But Rollag Woodland is made extra special by its long time of use, its care and maintenance, and the local history that it embodies. And I might add to that, we'll see some pictures later on, some closer up details of the interior of the school, because that's where the education was delivered and lived. The extent to which the interiors with all the school desks, the crock drinking reservoir, the stove, the murals and maps and globes that were used to teach geography, all those features of the interior of it it's remarkable that they have been preserved in a way that allows us to tell the story. That's not the case with many country schools that have been converted to use for a township hall or some other purpose. And so having this really as it's sort of frozen in time to tell the story of that heritage. So for 65 years, that local elementary school was a critical part of agricultural life. It allowed students to attend school during a 5-month school year, typically 2 months in the fall and 3 months in the spring. And they took the time around Christmas, around the New Year's, took that time off from going to school because it was too cold to keep the school heated, and there wasn't enough light to see to do lessons on the inside of the school. And so, in the earliest years, the school was a kind of a phased, fixed period of time in which the education was delivered. This was the first and the last country school in Clay County. That's remarkable when we look at the landscape and realize that the landscape was dotted with these schools at about 3-mile intervals in both directions on the landscape. And now this is the one of the last remnants, and it functioned, I think, for its purpose. It delivered quality elementary school education until 1961. The consolidation that happened was, much has been written about the influence of the state superintendent of schools wanting to encourage a better quality of education. But there was nothing fundamentally wrong with the elementary education that was delivered here, and it served very well to prepare young people to go on to future careers in farming, but also to attend high schools in Hawley and Barnesville, and to learn new skills that allowed them to broaden their experience of the world. So the remarkable photos and reminiscence are just a tremendous resource. But sometimes what gets lost is the real quality of that learning experience. We have the curriculum documented in several of these little pamphlets and brochures. The curriculum was essentially established by a 3-person school board, local school board, and the school was visited periodically by a county superintendent of schools and a state superintendent of schools, who tested the students at the end of 8th grade to certify that their learning was up to a fairly rigorous standard. I would say that, having seen some of those 8th grade superintendent's exams, I think they would challenge most of us as adults, given the range of things that they cover in terms of civics and constitutional government, American values, the writing and speaking, the knowledge of basic reading, writing and arithmetic. I think oftentimes those things just get sort of lumped into basic education, but to deliver those to kids between the ages of 6 and about 14 required a real dedicated organization of resources. So what some of these students have shared with us, they say, our teachers were really very nice. They taught us many things beside our studies, like courtesy, discipline, moral behavior. The teacher really held everything in order, and we obeyed her without question. There was no talking permitted, nor getting up and walking around without her permission. We each had to sit quietly and do our studies individually. if we needed to go to the outhouse, or if we needed to go to the library, which is one corner in the back of the room, or if the teacher was busy with other students, we could ask permission to go talk to one of our classmates to get help with a problem. But in that respect, older students often learned through teaching, but there was no talking allowed permitted even then. We raised our hands with 1, 2, or 3 fingers to signal to the teacher what we were asking permission for. Over time, the curriculum became, it broadened, and there were additional things, increased emphasis in history and world geography at the time of World War I. You know, this was the introduction to the idea that graduates of little country schools in the United States were going to be contributors to the national mission and objectives. So it's important both for a statewide and national audience. And I just feel so privileged to have had the opportunity to go back and revisit these photographs that were compiled by teachers. In this case, this is the school kids with their bibs in 1939 and 40. Let's see, I was looking for the name of somebody. We'll see one that comes along in a little bit. Someone who I got to know who is a product of this particular country school. The schools accomplished their purpose just fine for 65 years. And in the end, I would say that it was really more of a matter of their inability to do it economically, to provide this quality of education, the expected quality of education, with a single teacher and with textbooks that had to be replaced periodically and all the other learning resources. It got to the point that larger school systems, consolidated schools in Barnesville and Hawley, could deliver that education more economically than they could be delivered in little scattered country one-room schools all over the countryside. But it was let's say a bitter pill to swallow, the vote to consolidate this school into the Hawley school system. I think the local vote was 35 for consolidation and 30 against. And so clearly people believed that the quality of education was being provided to their students. And again, this was all driven by local decision making, by local funding, local taxing of the farms that were served by this school, local decisions about who to recruit and hire as school teachers. And I think from my perspective as an architectural historian, that's a really remarkable part of the story, that it's a local phenomenon. It is immediately responsible to local values and priorities. Teacher preparation varied from state to state, but in many rural school districts, only 2 years of teacher training was sufficient for elementary education. So in high school, there would be a 2-year certification program for people who wanted to be prepared to serve these country schools. It was just I suppose a pragmatic, obvious need that with the number of schools that had to have a teacher dedicated to them, they had to find talent wherever they could. And so, I suppose there may be people who would differ in this opinion that it doesn't take an awful lot of academic education or preparation to teach kids from let's say 1 to 12 years of age the basics that they will need to go forward. And I think that's a respect in which homeschooling seems to still work reasonably well. But in this pandemic era, I think parents are increasingly mindful that the ability of one country school teacher to hold this curriculum together for all these rambunctious students had to be a bit of a challenge. We have the grade records are recorded in this book, and the great photographs, these images, these photographic images that Mark Peel was kind enough to dig out of the archives here to share the historical record of it. I think there's a kind of local pride that goes along with having collected these resources and having been a member or participant in this. So, hundreds of these schools were sprinkled all over the state landscapes of North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. Teachers understood the value of cooperation, of civics, of relationships between neighbors, of honesty, of the ability to cooperate and care for community. And that was a fundamental part of education too, that probably doesn't show up on the roster of curriculum, but it was an important part of the moral teaching that was expected of these country schools. I wanted to highlight for the eligibility study in the lower right-hand corner of this rather dreary gray map. Woodland School is the one that's labeled there, but there were two other country schools that were, I count the little box there, the little mile squares, no more than 2.5 miles away to the north and to the south. And there would have been another one to the east and to the west. And so the distribution of these, there were these three local nearby elementary schools would compete in the spring for they would have a softball tournament that would be played one day in one schoolyard and one day in the next schoolyard. But can you imagine 130 little red squares scattered all over this map that really embodied all of Clay County? You know, the first two school districts in Clay County were Moorhead and I think Hawley, and the school district number 3 was established in Rollag Park Township. That was school district number 3 for the county. So the districts countywide were you know, a combination of urban and rural schools. It was quite an investment in education to be able to keep kids close enough to home where they could still return to help on the farm. The commemoration of seasons through pageants and plays at the school. For me, this is made vivid by some reminiscences from my own mother, who was had 2 years of high school education dedicated to teaching in country school in Iowa. And so I kind of see this process when one might question the competency of a country school teacher with only 2 years of high school preparation to teach. I think about my mom, and the last thing I would want to do would be to accuse her of not being qualified, because she built upon that education and her relationship with those country school kids. Her dad was worried sick about her having to go into the school on frosty winter mornings and maybe finding a hobo or a transient person sleeping in the school, or worried about the having to build a fire in that pot-bellied stove. You know, these were really standalone, and they were observed and supervised by the community. Let's see, where was my little passage here? I wanted to kind of remember some things about all that. In the interior of the school, it gives us a glimpse of the inside day. And again, I might challenge you to be on the lookout for some of these things that we talk about that were necessary fixtures of the school. The desks, there are actually 4 different generations of school desks here. And we're working from the left-hand side of the photograph in the upper right along the north wall of the school were the modern desks, the 2 rows of desks that serve the older students, the grades 6, 7, and 8 students. And then down the middle were a earlier generation of wood and wrought iron bench desks. And then along the right-hand edge there, they actually retrieved from somewhere out in a shelter belt or a nearby farm about a dozen of the original desks that were wrought iron side rails with the drop down chairs that I'm assuming that perhaps there are others who are watching with us tonight have remembrances of country schools that functioned in this way. Be on the lookout for things like the water cooler and the library in the back corner of this school. The coat rack and the display of murals and the chalkboards that were on the wall. The chalkboards were really just painted boards rather than slate chalkboards in many of these country schools. Notice the lights that provided illumination, but you know, that was a fairly late phenomenon. Park Township didn't have rural electrification until about 1940. And so for much of the life of this school, the lighting would have been through those big windows that run down the south and north walls of the school to provide good lighting for students to practice their penmanship and their writing for legibility. the fixtures and features that have been retained help to tell the story. And it's nice. I don't know that there is an open house date in which the alumni share this experience with other visitors, but I would think that with the encouragement and support of the Cultural and Heritage Society of Clay County, there must be a lot of local interest in this experience that probably seems so distant to many of us now that are trying to figure out how to make Zoom classes work on our home computers and so forth. America's audacious plan to educate every citizen as a fundamental aspect of democratic citizenship required a huge labor force that over time came to be dominated primarily by women. The dynamics of 19th century gender roles, America's chronic labor shortage was fulfilled by generations of mainly women teachers. Emphasis for teachers was always on the fundamental skills of reading and writing and arithmetic, but history and geography likewise took place in these schools. And the teachers' payments were really rather erratic. I think as maybe a baseline, we might look, in the earliest years, in around 1900, the teachers might be paid as much as $45 a month, but only for the 5 months that the school was in session. So they, of necessity, oftentimes took their room and board from nearby farm families. In the 1930s, the salaries were as little as $35 a month, which is the same thing that the WPA and the CCC were paying common laborers as work relief features. And so to be able to recruit capable teachers, it seems to me that it's quite obvious that this had to be a dedication of passion and caring and commitment rather than something that a line of work that a person got into to get rich. Let's see, those learning experiences. What do I want to say about this? In 1906, 85% of all Minnesota elementary teachers were women, earning an average of about $39 a month. For men teachers, it might be as much as $49 a month. The obvious inequities there really catch our attention today. They were saying the same work was asked of both of them. Usually married women were not eligible to continue teaching. They had to be single women to be eligible to serve in the country schools. But over time, with the increasing costs for fuel and rural electrification, longer school terms and transportation to get kids to the consolidated schools, it was the costs that really put these schools out of business, I think, as much as anything. I wanted to revisit, and it's just a kind of a personal thing with me. It's the basis that I see these teachers in, and it's fun. So many of the reminiscences of the alumni when they get together, they sat down and made a list. They were able to come up with the names of every teacher from 1896 to 1961 who had served at this country school, and many of them would know personal memories either from their own experience with the later generation of teachers or stories that were passed down from their grandparents or parents through the years. And so, these were very real people that were involved with this. My mom told me the story that she was minimally educated for this, but when she graduated in 1942 with a 2-year teaching certification, she started teaching and walked 1.5 miles to start the heat stove first thing in the morning. She prepared monthly holiday bulletin boards and display materials, which I helped her move several times throughout. She kept those resources going for 50 years, teaching primarily elementary students and special needs students, and continued to use a lot of those resources that were developed for sharing at the country school. Things in this school that that catch our attention: the maps, the murals, the piano. The piano is an upright grand piano from about 1906 and still seems to be reasonably well tuned for having been cold and warmed up. It's sits right in front of the radiant wood stove, and I think that's a for me, a very fascinating part to have found. Having visited a few of these country schools, this is the first one that I have seen that has the original cast iron stove that was originally for wood or for coal stove, but in the late 1930s, they added an oil burner at the bottom underneath that barrel stove, and so that it could be self-feeding and could run off of fuel oil. And then they put a protective jacket around the outside of the stove so that kids wouldn't get burned, and to kind of hold the heat in place. And to find that original, 1896 stove still available and functional, and telling the story about kids heating their lunches up on top of the stove or drying mittens and so forth. It's part of the memories that those alumni have kept alive and shared with us. So I don't nostalgia isn't just valuing these things it's not just a nostalgic things about the past. It's about seeing and observing how people were prepared to contribute to their community. I think it's the kind of thing that we understand better by seeing for ourselves. Excuse me, let me take a drink here. The interior fixtures and features and furnishings are part of what helps us to tell that story. Chris Hagan, the forum writer who visited the school, Lisa Veda was nice enough to share with him the clock on the wall. It would be on the left-hand side of the interior photo here. On the last day of school, as the last student was leaving from the school, the teacher unplugged the clock, and that was the last day that school was held, and that was exactly the time that the clock was stopped on the wall, and it hasn't moved since then. He said that just that story alone shared, it sent chills down his spine to think about this place being really frozen in time. The hot lunch program heated up on that stove. A lot of times the farm kids would bring leftovers from home for their lunch. Leftover hot dish. I'm picturing a lot of good Norwegian American hot dish in a little tin bucket to heat up on the stove. Or at times in the winter, the school would sometimes provide its own a big round tin of peanut butter and another big round tin of pork and beans. And the kids would bring plain bread from home to spread the peanut butter on, or the teacher would ask who brought bowls and spoons from home, and then she'd measure beans out into smaller containers and set it on the stove to heat. And when it came time to eat, each person would take the bowl to her, and she'd put beans in it for them. So it seems like a kind of a simple, honest way of experiencing elementary education. And I wanted to put up a little bit larger view of the interiors of these schools so that you can see what we're talking about. There's the crock that they would bring water in from the outside well pump, or in the early years, they would actually send someone down to the lake to bring water up from the edge of the lake to fill the water cooler. The stovepipe that feeds from the radiant stove up to the chimney stack. There's the ubiquitous American flag and Gilbert Stuart's George Washington portrait on the wall. Fun to see the age of the globes and the maps on the walls. These were part of the investment in local education. So teacher would call each row of students to order, and then they'd take turns washing their hands before they go into school. The discipline and rigor. Oh, my mom would have been perfect for that. She intimidated many generations of elementary school students with her hard-nosed bullying about standing in line or eating all of your beans, or whatever it was that the kids were expected to do. She did command that discipline. Rural elementary schools have been subjected to a lot of negative critique in recent years. There's an expectation in an age of professionalization that there's always a higher standard of education that might be delivered. But I think, the consolidation with town schools provided an extension of this elementary school education, but it does seem that many of the basic lessons that we associate with grades 1 to 7 or 1 to 8 in the country school are so fundamental that they prepared these students for where they were going next. And I just I'm surprised that the reviewers in St. Paul were unmoved by seeing these elementary school kids with their handmade barrel stave cross-country skis. That just seems to me so prototypically Scandinavian American. And you look at all that toe-headed those smiles, and it's part of the story that we would tell. I have a passage that I've read from time to time in trying to focus on what matters to us about this aspect of local decision making or local storytelling. And it's a piece that I actually saw it in the Farm Forum section of the Des Moines Register. Wendell Berry is an author, an environmentalist author. He's older than I am, so you know that he's probably kind of on his last legs by now too. He tells a story about my walks for many years have taken me down an old fence row in a wooded hollow on what was once my grandfather's farm. A battered galvanized bucket is hanging on the fence post near the head of the hollow, and I never go by that bucket without stopping to look inside, for what is going on inside that bucket is the most momentous thing I know, the greatest miracle that I have ever heard of. It's a microcosm of earth making. The old bucket has hung there through many autumns, and leaves have fallen around it, and some have fallen into it. The fallen leaves have held the moisture, and so they've rotted. Nuts have fallen into it or been carried into the bucket by squirrels. Mice and squirrels have eaten the meat of the nuts and left the shells. They and other animals have left their droppings. Insects have flown into the bucket and died and decayed. Birds have scratched in it and left their droppings and perhaps a feather or two. The slow work of growth and death, gravity and decay, is the chief work of the world, and has by now produced in the bottom of the bucket several inches of black humus. I look into that bucket with fascination because I'm a farmer of sorts and an artist of sorts. And I recognize there is an artistry and a farming far superior to mine or to that of any human. I've seen the same process at work on the tops of boulders in a forest, and it has been at work immemorial over most of the land surface of the world. We die into it ourselves, and we live by it. The old bucket started out a far better one than you can buy now. It's been hanging on that post for something like 50 years. I know something about that because when I was a small boy, I heard a story being told about tobacco hired hands that were working on the farm looking for something to boil an egg in. And they told the story about one of the farm hands that got to eat the egg that was covered with tar. The boiling water softened the residue of tar, and the man who ate the black egg was Floyd Scott, who I remember to this day. Seems to me important that these stories that we tell, generic stories. I guess this is a little bit like Mayberry, or a little bit like Walton's Mountain. We've sentimentalized these things so much, but these were real people, and the stories that we associate with these events are there as much as anything a part of who we are. Let's see, here we go. However small a landmark the old bucket is, it's not trivial. It's one of the signs by which I know my country and myself. It's doing in a passive way what human community must do actively and thoughtfully. A human community, too, must collect leaves and stories and turn them to account. It must build soil and build that memory of itself in lore and story and song that become its culture. And these two kinds of accumulation of local soil and local culture are intimately related. A human community, if it is to last long, must exert a kind of centripetal force holding local soil and local memory in place. Practically speaking, human society has no work more important than this. There ends the lesson. My college students used to get put out with me for being too preachy about these things, but I think valuing heritage and community, valuing our relationship to our neighbors, knowing the history and story about how our communities came to be is it's an essential part of what adds to our quality of life and our understanding of where we are today. One more drink here and we'll make the push to the finish. I see I'm down to my last 2 pages of notes, so it can't last long. Now, I've tried to not be unfairly critical of the reviews that were made in good faith of the eligibility study that I submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office. They want to give careful scrutiny to this because they want to know when the National Register nomination eventually goes forward that it will be accepted by the reviewers in Washington, D.C. So they have very rigorous standards for the quality of writing or the verification of the research or the evidence that's provided. But I think the story, from my perspective, is much larger than just being about consolidation of education. It's about the education that was delivered for those 65 years. And so for a visitor to this community to be able to see and experience this myself and to see the reminiscences have been collected, I greatly value the contribution that was made by those alumni in putting together this story or compiling it. You're soon to embark on the next step of this process. As I mentioned, the Minnesota Historical Society, through their Cultural Heritage Grants Program, provides funding to do eligibility studies, to write National Register nominations, to do architectural studies of the way the work needs to be performed if work is to be performed according to the Secretary of Interior standards. And then lastly, they will provide money for the actual work. It does tend to draw this process out perhaps longer than I am personally comfortable with. The determination has been made in a letter on the 1st of September from the State Historic Preservation Office that says this property is eligible for National Register listing under criterion A for its education associated with rural education in Clay County from 1896 to 1961. The property may also be eligible under criterion C as an intact example of rural school buildings. I saw persuading them of the validity of those two arguments it was kind of a breakthrough. I think through the readings of the drafts, there was a kind of a reluctance to concur that this is an important fixture of local heritage and of education. But the school clearly, and the bottom bullet point down here is taken verbatim from that letter from the State Historic Preservation Office that puts them on record as saying this school continues to clearly demonstrate those associations through excellent integrity. That means that it's been kept up unaltered. It hasn't been moved off of its original site or setting. It's been maintained. And this is, again, something that I'll take partial credit for, as well as robust interpretation. I added a page to the report before we submitted it, trying to persuade them that the fact that there's an active alumni association that keeps these stories alive and going every year by meeting and maintaining the property. They've invested in this for generations now, say 3 generations of family who have an association with this school. So that's quite an investment to make, both financial investment and an investment of caring and commitment. The caring that has been added through the Western Minnesota Steam Threshers Reunion Association. I get quite a kick out of going out there and seeing all those steam tractors and even the small gasoline engines every Labor Day weekend. I don't think I would ever get tired of seeing that history and heritage brought to life. And so, that the fact that those grounds are just almost immediately adjacent, less than a quarter of a mile away from this school, is that's something that enables this robust interpretation of local culture and local heritage. And then lastly, the role and the presence of the Cultural and Heritage Society of Clay County in promoting and documenting and collecting these records and really celebrating this history by pursuing the grant support for us to be together and share these stories or share my perceptions of this. That caught the attention of the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office. The school continues to demonstrate its historic associations through excellent integrity as well as robust interpretations. And I regard that maybe as my biggest personal success in having contributed to this National Register eligibility study. Drawing their attention to the fact that this is still part of our living heritage. This is part of what rural Clay County continues to be about, even though so much has changed on the landscape. You know, all the tractors now have GPS and are self-guided digital operations. But you know, this heritage is part of the continuity. So I would ask that, you know, those of you who have an investment in this school and an investment in this heritage. You didn't have to attend this school, but it's part of your heritage if you're from rural Clay County. Don't let anything impede the recognition and preservation of this heritage. I think, let's see, was that the one that had the, yeah. The Cultural and Heritage Society of Clay County under Maureen Kelly Jonason's leadership will soon be recruiting a consultant to take this forward the next step, to write the National Register document. It's a good time for me to bow out. I have a feeling that maybe some of my critique of this school has not been especially welcomed in St. Paul. And so I'm not real thin-skinned. I've taken enough criticism over time that I'll get over it, but I think it's time probably for someone else to see this and to develop that National Register nomination. I thank you for the opportunity to have seen it, to have learned from your experience, and to celebrate this cultural heritage for all the people of Clay County. If you have questions for me at any time, if there's something that you didn't have a question about today, my email is on there, martensfrozenmusic@gmail at the bottom of this, and I would certainly welcome hearing either supportive concurrence, or if there are things that you feel strongly you disagree with me about, I would welcome any perspectives about that, and I would be more than happy to take any questions. Davin, if you can help us sort our way through anything, there ends the lesson.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here, Steve. People might be asking specifically about Clay County. If you don't have that specific information, but you done some research on rural education elsewhere, you might answer it that way. So Leanna Freed asks if you can share any more general information about the student population and how the population at this school varied over 65 years.
As long as farm families were at that age where they were raising the next generation of school kids, that was relatively constant. The largest enrollments would have been 35 students in the 8 grades in 1896 to 1900, but it continued at that same rate up until, let's say, World War I. So from my perspective, I might divide that local school attendance into maybe 3 epochs. Let's say before World War I, then the effects of the Great Depression and World War II, and then the reform of education in anticipation of consolidation that really began post-war through 1950. And so really throughout that whole time, they were serving about, it would be, let's see, if we've got 35 students in 8 grades, about 5 or 6 students at each year level, and their lesson plan would have been developed for that. Now, it is interesting around Minnesota. This would be pretty typical of the pattern that supported farm schools or schools for farm families and farm kids. I did see a school that really surprised me, a school up in Kitson County, a really sparsely populated county in the northwestern corner of the state. And at one time they had 86 students in their country school. They actually built a 2-story school building and would have half the students on the first floor and half on the second floor. But they continued to serve that level of attendance because there were that many, in that instance, Norwegian American and Swedish American farm families within that walking distance of school. So I hope that maybe speaks to the question of how level was the attendance at these schools. It was pretty consistent.
Sure, yeah, I think so. We got a couple of questions I'll combine here. One is a question about the average tenure for the teachers at these schools. How long did they stay? And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of these teachers were primarily women, apparently young women. Um, were these young women from the local community, or had they traveled from elsewhere typically?
I think in the first, let's say 30 years, they would have been from the county. Probably they would have been young women who were educated in the county. Their tenure would typically have only been a year or two. Seldom did they stay longer than a couple of years. They either moved on to other school systems, or started families of their own, or uh, uh, maybe pursued some additional. The establishment of the normal school in Moorhead was really fundamental to, let's say, elevating the standard of preparation for teachers who could have, with additional college education, could be much more confident coming into these schools in both the skills of managing the robust student class and so forth. But typically, I think the list that the alumni wrote on the chalkboard there, I think there were about 60, no, there were about 50 teachers that they could account for in the 65 years. So not often was it longer than about a year and a half or 2 years.
Cool, thank you. And I I just got a message from Mark too, our archivist here, that the longest tenure was Viola Ryerson, 7 years in the 50s, but most teachers, like you mentioned, 1 or 2 years.
That's
Uh,
excellent. I really appreciate Mark's perspective on that. That's great. He has spent a lot of time studying the records of this school, and knows the teachers almost like individuals. So that's wonderful.
let's see, I wrote down some others. Um, do you know of any other standing schoolhouses? You talked about integrity, being on their original site. Do you know of any other standing schoolhouses on their original site in either Cass or Clay counties? Just as, some way to get a sense of how rare or common these places are.
They are increasingly rare, and I would say at this point very rare. I do not know of any others that are essentially as well maintained, intact on their site as this one is, either in Clay or Cass County. There have been a number of, I would say maybe a dozen National Register nominations for one-room country schools in Minnesota over, let's say, the past 20 years or whatever. I know there's one down near Herman, Minnesota, that was successfully listed. I wrote a nomination for one up in Walsh County, the Hoff Rural School near Adams. And so there are a few, the ones that have been the best preserved are those which do have their interior furnishings and fixtures intact, because that's such an important part of the story. And so where people have converted these to township halls, or in some cases, it's always so disheartening to see when they've been reduced to like grain storage or something like that. When you see, see an old country school filled up to the windows with grain for temporary storage. So I guess the short answer to your question is I really don't know of others in Cass or Clay County that do their job as honorably as this one does.
Sure. We have an audience of historians. So Maureen, our director, she writes that Morgan Township Hall is a one-room schoolhouse, but I don't know about the fixtures like you're mentioning, or the upkeep.
And if I could jump in, another of my favorites, and I'd like to visit with Maureen about it sometime. The Mullen Township School was WPA construction, and it's in Clay County, just northeast of Moorhead, and it is remarkable. It's wonderful. Now it would be a much newer school. It would be 50 years newer than this, but it's tremendous, and it's still used, I understand, for a township hall, for township elections and things of that nature, maybe for 4-H club meetings. But that's another one that comes to mind as really exceptional.
Okay. And we got a lot of compliments, so I want to pass those on to you, Steve. But I think just one more question about how listing on the National Registry might limit interpretation or the kinds of events that can be held there. Do you have any information about that?
It's a great question. I'm glad, someone took the time to ask the question. The listing on the National Register in no way inhibits a private property owner from doing pretty much whatever they want to with the property. It in no way freezes the building. However, for a public building, if grant money is pursued, the work has to be done consistent with the Secretary of Interior's guidelines and standards, and they're very detailed and specific. They would require that if a new roof was put on this, it would have to be a historically accurate cedar shingle roof. Any work would have to be consistent with those guidelines. But in terms of the question was about interpretation, and I think no, it really would not in any way limit the interpretation of it as a country school, because the significance is for its education. It ought to be interpreted as an educational facility. If it would, you could not use public resources. You couldn't use public money, say county highway funds, to relocate it to another site. I think that's it was so comforting to me to see it on its site so close to the Steam Threshers Union, because they have moved in a number of historic buildings there that lend themselves to their interpretation of that history. But to meet the National Register guidelines, you can't use public resources to harm or damage or degrade the building. But interpretation, I think that's, I've visited, I'm not really big on what reenactments, historical reenactments myself. That's not my thing, but I've visited several things like the Harkin store down near New Ulm, and many people find a way to, say, once or twice a year to put on a demonstration where someone will recruit a bunch of little kids to come in here and fill up those chairs and so forth and sit through at least an hour of country school education. It's I think the opportunities for interpretation are much greater than the limitations on interpretation. So, and if that's not the answer to the question that the questioner was asking, please don't hesitate to send me a message at my email address there, and I'll try to give you a better, more complete answer. I've got a lot of experience with this National Register process, and from my point of view, it's the most flexible and least restrictive of all the historic preservation measures. We talk about adaptive reuse projects and investment in putting new functions in historic buildings. So many different things that are part of historic preservation, but the National Register process, I just don't see a downside to it. I don't see any way in which it inhibits or limits our respect and treatment of heritage.
Perfect. I think that's a fantastic answer. With that, Steve mentioned his email address earlier in the webcast, so you can find him if you have more questions. If you'd like to reach out to us at HCSCC, the best way to go about that is to, again, visit us at the MCOM Center or find us online at www.hcscconline.org. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thanks for attending.